Everybody knows the legend. General Patton, the Iron Fist of the Third Army, solved problems with tanks, velocity, and overwhelming force. But in the spring of 1945, Patton hit a German defense that armor couldn't crack. Not a fortified bunker complex, not a desperate panzer counterattack. It was the city of Kronberg, transformed into a precise, industrial-scale death trap by a career Wehrmacht officer. A direct assault would have eaten a week and hundreds of American lives. Patton cleared it in 36 hours. 0 casualties. And he didn't use artillery. He used a 20-minute dictation that violated every principle of conventional warfare. The formations capable of contesting the Third Army's push in a straight-up fight had already been shattered, captured, or shoved back to defensive lines deeper east. What lingered in the German cities and towns rolling under Patton's treads was a grim cocktail. SS remnants operating under orders to die in place. Volkssturm militia, grandfathers and teenagers, handed rifles and told to stand. And scattered regular Wehrmacht officers caught in an impossible position, serving a regime that had already lost, while trying to preserve enough personal honor to face themselves in the mirror afterward. Kronberg occupied a strategic crossroads in central Germany. Its importance to Patton's advance had nothing to do with size or symbolism. The road network threading through Kronberg fed directly into routes the Third Army needed for its next operational phase. Speed through Kronberg meant preserving momentum, the single quality that defined Patton's army. Delay at Kronberg meant gifting the Germans further east with hours to harden resistance. Hours measured in American blood. The man responsible for Kronberg's defense was Colonel Werner Alderman, career Wehrmacht. He'd served since before the war, Poland, France, the Eastern Front. The kind of combat record the German military rewarded with decorations, promotions, and professional respect. That respect was the only currency still worth anything in an army hemorrhaging everything else. Alderman was no fanatic. He was no ideologue. He was a soldier with an order, and he intended to execute it. Because executing orders was what soldiers did. Because he'd spent 3 decades constructing an identity around that single principle. The order was blunt. Hold Kronberg. Hold it at any cost. Deny it to the Americans as long as humanly possible. Alderman assessed his available forces against what was bearing down on him and reached a cold conclusion. Conventional defense was suicide. He lacked the manpower and equipment to stop the Third Army in open combat. What he possessed was time, engineers, and a city full of structures that could be converted from shelter into weapons. What Alderman's engineers did to Kronberg in the days before Patton's arrival was systematic, thorough, and deeply professional. Professional in the particular way German military engineering was always professional. Executed with precision, meticulous attention to detail, and absolute indifference to the civilians still living inside the city. They mined the main roads. They mined the bridges. They mined every building American soldiers would instinctively use for cover during an urban fight. The town hall, the hospital, the church, the school. Explosives wired to doors, windows, staircases, cellar entrances. Every square meter of Kronberg's urban landscape became a killing ground, engineered to annihilate any force that moved through it the way forces normally move through cities. Then they pulled German military personnel back to defensive positions along the eastern edge, and waited. Patton's advance elements reached Kronberg's outskirts on a Tuesday morning, late March. Initial reconnaissance flagged something strange. The city sat quiet. No visible German defensive posture on the approaches, no artillery, no snipers. None of the resistance Patton's men had been conditioned to expect from a defended position. The streets were empty. Buildings stood undamaged. From the outside, it resembled a city that had simply chosen surrender without a fight. The officer leading the forward elements sent word back. Something was off. He couldn't name it precisely. But the absence of resistance in a city marked for defense felt wrong. Wrong in that specific, bone-deep way, things feel wrong to soldiers who've survived long enough to trust their instincts over their eyes. He asked for permission to halt, to run a proper reconnaissance before pushing into the urban grid. Permission came back approved. And the recon teams found the mines. Not all of them, not right away, but enough to make the picture unmistakable. Kronberg had been engineered as a kill zone, on a scale no one in Patton's engineer corps had seen during this entire campaign. The assessment that reached Third Army headquarters was blunt. Clearing Kronberg safely would consume days, maybe a full week. It would demand engineering assets heavy enough to stall the broader advance, while everything concentrated on one city. Patton reviewed that report at his headquarters. He went quiet. Quiet for longer than his staff was accustomed to from him. Then he asked a question. What was the best available intelligence on the German commander responsible for Kronberg? The name Colonel Werner Alderman came back, with a service record attached. Patton read the record. Then he began dictating a message, addressed directly to Colonel Werner Alderman, commanding German forces in and around Kronberg. Delivery went through captured German radio frequencies and a local civilian intermediary willing to carry a written copy through the lines. Patton's staff had doubts this would reach its target. Patton told them to send it regardless. The message said this. It said General Patton was aware of the preparations made inside Kronberg, that he understood the military reasoning behind them. It acknowledged the engineering work as competent. It expressed professional respect for thorough preparation. Then it said none of that would alter the outcome. The Third Army was going to take Kronberg no matter how it had been fortified. The only variable was what the city looked like when it was over. And then the message said something Patton's own staff had never heard from him, not phrased quite like this. It said that if Alderman's forces withdrew from Kronberg and provided accurate maps showing every mine location within the city, Patton would guarantee treatment as prisoners of war in full accordance with the Geneva Convention. Alderman's cooperation would be documented in the official Third Army report, in terms that honestly reflected what he had done. But if Alderman chose to hold, if American soldiers died on mines buried in Kronberg streets, Patton said he would personally direct every resource the Third Army possessed against German positions east of the city, without the restraint he would otherwise extend to an enemy operating within accepted boundaries of warfare. The men who died on those mines, their deaths would sit on Alderman's ledger, and Patton intended to settle that ledger completely. Then one final passage. It said Patton had reviewed Alderman's service record, that it belonged to a professional soldier who had fought honorably through difficult circumstances across many years. Professional soldiers who served with honor, the message said, deserved to finish their service with honor. The choice Alderman made in the next 12 hours would determine whether that remained possible. By any standard, this was an extraordinary piece of communication from a commanding general to an enemy officer. Patton's staff argued afterward about what it actually was, a threat, an offer, or something caught between the two. The honest answer was all three at once, which was exactly how Patton functioned at his sharpest. He had handed Alderman a reason to comply, a consequence for refusal, and an appeal to the professional identity this German officer had spent a lifetime building. All of it delivered in under 2 pages, composed in fewer than 20 minutes. Colonel Alderman got the message at his forward command post east of Kronberg. He read it twice. Then he gathered his senior officers and told them what it contained. The discussion that followed ran 3 hours, longer than Patton had given him, but shorter than it might have lasted under different circumstances. These were officers who had spent years fighting in the Wehrmacht, men who had watched the army they served twisted into the instrument of a regime that annihilated everything they believed they were defending. They had arrived at this moment in a German city, Spring of 1945. With nothing left to protect except the professional identity Patton's message had directly addressed. They were not unanimous, but they were a majority. Alderman sent his response. It stated he was prepared to discuss terms. The language was stiff military formality, the kind German officers employed when they needed the shelter of procedure. But the meaning was unmistakable. He would comply. The maps reached Third Army headquarters the next morning, detailed, accurate, comprehensive in a way Patton's engineers said they hadn't anticipated. Every mine position in Kronberg, marked. Every wired explosive, identified. The maps had been assembled with the same professional precision that had gone into designing the trap itself, which meant they could be trusted. And that trust saved American lives that would otherwise have been spent. Patton's engineers moved through Kronberg with those maps and cleared the city in 36 hours. Not the week they had estimated. The advance pushed forward. Kronberg fell without a single American casualty from mines. That would not have been true if Alderman had chosen differently. Alderman and his men were processed as prisoners of war exactly as Patton had promised. His cooperation was entered into the official Third Army report exactly as Patton had promised. Whether any of this helped him in the post-war proceedings that followed remains unclear in the record. What the record does show is that when Patton learned Kronberg was cleared and the advance could resume, he said only that it was the right outcome, that Alderman had made the right choice, that he hoped the German officer understood the choice he'd made was the honorable one, not the easy one, because those were not always the same thing. In this case, they happened to be. His staff pressed him afterward. What would he have done if Alderman hadn't responded? What would have happened to Kronberg if the German commander had held his ground and forced Patton to fight through a mined city, street by street? Patton looked at the officer who asked this for a long moment. Then he said he would have done exactly what he had threatened. He would have brought everything available against the German positions. He would not have moderated that response in any way. Threats not backed by intention, he said, were not threats. They were requests. And he had never once in his life issued a request when he meant a threat. Then he added something else. He said he had genuinely hoped Alderman would respond the way he did. Not because it simplified the military situation, though it did. Because the alternative would have forced him to destroy the professional record of a soldier who had, by all available evidence, served with genuine honor inside a dishonorable cause. He said there were not many of those left in the German army by the spring of 1945. He saw no reason to waste them unnecessarily. His staff agreed afterward. It was the most Patton thing he'd said in a very long time. The threat had been real. The respect had been real. The outcome existed because both of those things were communicated clearly to a man capable of understanding them. And George Patton had known from the start that Alderman was that kind of man. He had read his service record and recognized in it the outline of someone who, under different circumstances, might have been precisely the type of soldier Patton most respected. The war ended 6 weeks later. Patton never met Alderman in person. The two men, behind one of the war's strangest negotiations, never occupied the same room, never shook hands, never had the conversation their messages kept circling toward. They spoke through intermediaries, through radio frequencies, through a civilian who carried a handwritten note across the lines, through the shared professional language of soldiers, men who understood each other well enough to strike a deal without ever standing face to face. And that was sufficient. In a war grinding toward its end, but not yet finished, with men still dying every day for terrain that would mean nothing in 6 weeks, it was more than sufficient.